Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nomonde Mabuya, your facilitator for this session on benefits of doing clinical trials amongst the diverse and to be more inclusive. So just by way of introduction, I'll just make one more statement, then I'll hand over to my esteemed panelists to then share with us. I will basically share a few questions that are different to each panelist, but it will be really more of a conversation. But by way of beginning, I'll start by maybe laying the foundation, the benefits of doing clinical trials. Clinical trials are a key research tool for advancing medical knowledge and patient care. They do assist to discover new treatments for diseases as well as new ways to detect and diagnose and reduce the chances of developing diseases. Unfortunately, disparities do exist when testing new drugs and therapies, and that's really why we are having this particular conversation. Can I allow my esteemed panel to maybe introduce themselves first before we go into the meat of it? I've got Professor Karen, if maybe they can just introduce themselves. If Prof. Karen is not here, I'm going to ask Dr. Jude to also go ahead and introduce himself.
Thank you, Dr. Mabuya. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation from Africa Bio and for setting up this Bio Africa convention. I am Jude Ngang, and I currently work with Amgen, a pharmaceutical company based out of California in the United States. And my primary role here is working with a team to improve the representation and diversity of the clinical trials that Dr. Mabuya mentioned in ensuring that we study the drugs across a representative patient population. And prior to this current role that it's a very fascinating work. I was involved in the design and execution of clinical trials in the early phases, so translational science phase 1 and phase 2. And as a background, I'm also originally from Cameroon in Africa, and I am a pharmacist by training. It's a pleasure sharing the podium with such renowned sort of experts, and I look forward to the interesting conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me hand over to Professor Veronica to also introduce herself.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Mabuya, and so nice to meet the other panelists here. I'm Veronica Miller. I'm an adjunct professor at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. And my job is to lead the Forum for Collaborative Research, which is designed, which was set up really to bring together the community, the patient voices, the industry, the governments, and the academic researchers to forge a path forward where we need new drugs and diagnostics for unmet medical needs. And one of our projects is on HIV, and that's the one I will be talking about today. But we work in 6 different disease areas, always using the same model of multi-stakeholder collaboration.
Thank you so much, Professor Veronica. Let me also do the same and welcome Professor Moses.
Unmute myself. So I'm Moses Vokari. I work for the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, EDCTP, and I am the Regional Director for Africa. And so before relocating to South Africa, I was Professor of International Health Sciences in the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. My main interest is in neglected tropical diseases. So today I'll be talking more from the funder's perspective because EDCTP is the biggest funder of clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Let me go ahead and also welcome Professor Osandu to please introduce himself and go ahead, please, Professor Osandu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mabuya. My name is Osandu Owoji. I am an assistant professor at the Duke University. I work at the Duke Global Health Institute at the Center for Policy Impact in Global Health. I am from Nigeria, and my background is in medicine, right now I do more population health and health economics research. And our current work at our team includes looking at investments to improve clinical trial, to strengthen clinical trial capacity in low and middle income countries for diseases of poverty, and also to think about alternative funding mechanisms that will expand both the diversity in terms of location, funding streams, and all in low and middle income countries. And I'll be talking about two of our projects today. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be presenting alongside the esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I've covered all our members of our esteemed panel. I will then go straight to asking a few questions. And I think if you want to support your presentation, you've all been allocated a bit of time with the presentation you've prepared, that will also be fine. But my first question will be to Dr. Jude. Why do we need diversity in clinical trials? And why is it important?
Thank you, Dr. Mabuya. So I think, if I may, that your question is actually the very first, the first slide of my presentation actually addresses the question. So is it okay if I sort of share some slides right now?
That's fine. That's okay. That's okay.
Okay, thank you. Give me a moment. So can you let me know if you could see what I'm sharing?
Yes, we can see.
Great, thank you. I think it's very important, Dr. Mabuya, you mentioned already why it's important for diversity, but diversity in trials. And I would first start by really addressing why is it important. Of course, the underrepresentation of some populations in developing these innovative therapies. There's been data that has shown that if we do not include the appropriate representation, we are collecting incomplete data or limited trial data that was not generalizable to the general population. And we're also limiting access to innovative treatment to some vulnerable populations in some therapeutic areas. This is the option that some patients might have. But most importantly, also, the underrepresentation leads to disparities in health outcomes. That's one of the contributions to the disparities and overall disparities in health equity as well. And I'm sure there's been some significant data recognizing that there's differences and incidence in disease, but also differences in the efficacy and response to products based across various racial and ethnic groups. So with these differences, then it really warrants that we have a very patient-centric approach. I think it was Dr. Miller, as I was listening in her introduction, really called out that particular aspect of the patient being there. So we have to look at it from the patient perspective as we design these trials going forward to ensure appropriate representation. And in the final comment about why is it really important, the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted again further why this problem is a very important one to address now and going forward, where we've seen the various, in the United States, for example, we notice quite differently the morbidity and mortality of the COVID-19 virus across various racial and ethnic populations. So that continues to build the evidence why this is important. And if I may proceed on with a few more slides, just to highlight the continuation of this problem within the actions that Amgen is doing. So at Amgen, we started working on this issue since 2016, and it started within our employee resource group called ABEN, the Amgen Black Employee Resource Group, where we did start by highlighting this issue, inviting speakers to come and highlight to our organization and also the rest of the industry that action needs to be taken. Fast forward 2020, we have a dedicated team now called RISE, Representation and Research, that I represent the team here in today's discussion. And this team was formed for the sole purpose to improve the proportional representation of our clinical trials and to also advance this dialogue globally as well. And that team, which is done some phenomenal work, which I would just highlight a few of the aspects here. So first, to begin, we had to first set some goals. We set some ambitious goals with timelines as well. So these goals have short, medium, and long-term goals, and we expect to achieve these some results within 3 to 5 years. And even though they're ambitious, we hope to exceed the current industry benchmark for representation of people from diverse races, identities, socioeconomic status, geographies in our clinical trials in the United States. As we're doing this, we're really putting together the best practices and strategies that are working, and we plan to expand beyond the United States, within the next 3 to 5 years. I would like to point out that at the same time, we're really studying what the barriers are to enrollment in trials across other regions and countries, and these objectives, to meet these objectives, we set up a strategy. It's a 6-pillar strategy, and the strategy covers clinical trials as one, data analytics, and we also have to go further into translational sciences, external collaboration, just to call out a few. Now, I would say, how are we going to do this to achieve the goals? Now, it takes a thorough review of the current process that we do take in carrying out clinical trials. I think it was Professor Osondu mentioned some of these aspects as well, that I noticed some synergy in his introduction, where we are looking at where patients have historically and people have historically been excluded, to implement support strategies to help remove the barriers and enhance participation. One example I can call out is even transportation. Sometimes the trials, for example, could be located at a location that is not very accessible. So what measures can we put in place to sort of remove these barriers? And secondly, we plan to collaborate with clinical trial investigators and staff across a wide range of background who can be trusted and really knowledgeable partners for a diverse patient population. And thirdly, we plan to bring the research directly to the communities where people live and work as much as possible, sort of decentralizing the clinical trials. And then fourthly, we'll change how we communicate with patients, with patients' caregivers, and also overall the healthcare providers. And then partnering, our fifth approach is also partnering with community organizations, faith-based organizations. So organizations that these patients do trust, to partner with them to work together. Now, I would like to call out the translational science aspect, which is one of the sixth approach, which is, I think it's important. I take this also very seriously, where we're enhancing the precision medicine awareness and translational sciences participation as well, but with the emphasis in increasing the diversity of the biobanks. Now, I'll talk just a couple more minutes or a minute about the translational science piece. We are well in the era of targeted therapies, precision medicine, where therapy is uniquely targeted for a patient's specific makeup, biologically, or expression of the patient's condition. And with this, as these therapies have been developed and we're advancing further, there is concern that there is underrepresentation of the participation of some populations in these biobanks. And we do take this very critical, and we have to accelerate our work. If not, the gap would widen even further, to ensure that we get multiple populations to participate in biobanks and translational science. Now, I would just close by highlighting some of the work that we're going in, or that we're doing right now. And it's really first to highlight that it's a journey that we're on. We're using a very humble approach, an approach of listening, communicating and learning as we go, understanding that the realities and perspectives and there's variation across various populations in terms of culture and regular lifestyle. So we're constantly learning and tweaking our strategy. We appreciate that everyone involved in the clinical trial process, from clinicians, staff, patients, families, from all races, identities, backgrounds, socioeconomic status, and geographies, they're making the road ahead. And sustainable change will only occur if there is a collective willingness to learn, agree, commit, and most importantly, cooperate to co-create solutions. Now, towards this end, Amgen proudly stands with the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association of America, PhRMA, on the first ever industry-wide principles on clinical trial diversity, building trust and acknowledging the historic mistrust of clinical trials within some communities, but also, most importantly, reducing barriers to clinical trial access, using real-world data, for example, to enhance the information on diverse population and enhancing information about diversity and inclusion in clinical trials overall. Now, there is wide engagement across Amgen for the work we are doing to exceed industry standards in clinical trial diversity, to develop drugs based on trials conducted with representation of the patients who are likely to receive the treatment. We plan to regularly share our learnings as we're on this journey and progress with our industry colleagues and the broader medical research community to really enable future scholarship and commitment. And now we also are really open for potential collaboration, as I mentioned in our 6-pillar strategy, that we cannot do this work alone. We can only do so much, but we need the whole healthcare ecosystem to come together. Finally, in closing, I would say Amgen sincerely believes that appropriate representation in our clinical trials will contribute towards ensuring health equity for all. I think with that, I can pause and maybe take other questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. We will come back to you in the second round. I just want to give every speaker an opportunity to answer the first question, the first round of questions. I will then come to Professor Veronica, just to maybe share with us, what are the barriers preventing diversity and inclusion in clinical trials? If maybe you can just share, and how do we ensure that we sort of break these barriers, or are there specific categories that we should also be aware of that are preventing us from achieving diversity and inclusion in clinical trials? Over to you, Professor Veronica.
Thank you so much for that question, and that is so important. And I also wanted to just congratulate you, and Gang, and your colleagues for the excellent program that you have established at Amgen. We have talked about disparities and inclusion in clinical trials for so long now, and we're still always coming back to the same question: why is it so difficult, and what are the barriers? And I think it's such an important question too, because participation in research has so many advantages to communities. When communities do participate in research, it brings a whole level of understanding to the community if they are engaged appropriately in the research. And so I think one of the main barriers that I see, and I'm speaking now very broadly from a global perspective, of course, it's going to be different in individual communities. One of the major barriers really is not integrating the community sufficiently. And we've seen this over and over with COVID. We can just even look at the United States and look at the rollout of testing, the rollout of vaccines and treatment. And the need to really, and it's so hard to really present this in a few words about what it really means to integrate a community in research. We have disciplines like community participatory practice, etc. But the task of actually going to the communities, engaging with people, bringing them into discussions before we even start the trials, before we even think about doing clinical trials, I think is one of the most important steps. That then, of course, also really needs to come together with trust. There needs to be trust between, and when I say communities, I also mean it broadly, not just the people that might participate in clinical trials or potential patients or end users, but really the community at the complete level. And there needs to then be trust between that community in a larger sense with the study sponsors, with the regulatory authorities, with any other agencies that are involved as well. So I think one of the biggest barriers to me still is that we're not really integrating with the community sufficiently.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Veronica. Can we then maybe with that in mind move then to try and identify some of the potential approaches and solutions to maybe effective recruitment of communities which remain underrepresented in the clinical trials? What should investigators be doing in terms of making sure that the clinical trials are broad and inclusive as much as we could? Could I then maybe allow Professor Moses to maybe answer specifically that question? And maybe also identify some of the barriers that prevent us from actually being more engaging in our quest to include everybody. Over to you, Professor Moses.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mabuya. So I think I'll just spend time starting to talk about the second topic that you introduced, which are barriers. Now, from the point of view of funders, I think the biggest barrier to conducting clinical trials, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is the limited capacity to do that. Capacity in terms of human capital, and also in terms of lab, the lab capacity. So we know, for instance, for sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, South Africa is the country which the biggest capacity to do clinical trials. And but a lot of other countries have got limited capacity just because they haven't got the infrastructure. And we now know with the COVID-19 situation that we need to enable the environment in even smaller countries like Liberia, like Guinea, so that they also are able to conduct clinical trials, because we do know, especially in this particular context, people need to have their ethical and regulatory authorities carrying out proper practices. So these are all the limited capacities that we have for these countries have been really the most important barriers to conducting clinical trials, and why so many other countries are not involved in that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Let me then move to another question, which will involve the issue of, are there opportunities or new areas that we think we should be positioning ourselves to take advantage of what is emerging, especially in the advent of COVID having done what it has done to humankind? Are there new opportunities or barriers that we should be going for and advancing to take advantage of the situation? Let me hand over to Professor Osondu to take over that particular question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mabuya, and thanks to all the other panelists, Professor Bukai and Professor Veronica and Dr. Gang. This is a very important topic, and I think that there are, in addition to the barriers that have been described, big barrier is funding, and how not just the amount of funding, but also how you do spend this funding, what you invest in, and the kinds of returns you get. So I come at this question from a health systems, health financing perspective. And we think for this question in particular, we think about three questions. Clearly, we know that clinical trials are good. And is it okay if I just share my screen so I could just share?
Yes, go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
Okay. So just put that here. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Yeah. So some of this has been talked about, but I just want to state here really that so thinking about it from a financing perspective and all, we can't help but notice this double jeopardy where minority populations get very little investment. And when minority or disadvantaged populations also suffer from diseases that affect the majority, they also get very little attention. And so a very big example here will be cardiovascular medications, antihypertensives in African Americans, and also cancer clinical trials where you see these minority or disadvantaged populations not being properly represented in a disease that actually has a very high burden. When you think about diseases that affect minor populations, minority populations, classic will be sickle cell disease versus cystic fibrosis, and you see cystic fibrosis has more investment. So funding is a big barrier. But then when you think about these questions, why, when you think, there's been this historical argument that when you, the reason for not investing in these so-called diseases of poverty is because it does not make economic sense. But then if you dive deeper and ask, why do you improve diversity? I would think that there are three big reasons, right? So there is a moral reason. We think that it's the right thing to do. And whatever we need to do it. And some of Dr. Gang's work really hits this on the head. Basically says, this is what we need to do, and whatever is going to cost, we should do it, even if it's not cost effective. It also saves lives, and I'll show in two slides how some of the modeling that we've done shows that it can improve lives. The last point here is that it improves people's livelihoods. People who benefit from trials get better, they live longer, and they are meaningful contributors to society. And it's also good for business on the company side, right? Because the benefits cost ratios that we have seen from the investor's perspective are high. And this has been talked about. The lower three are the ones that I just like to highlight here. From a financing perspective, we think that when you're trying to diversify, introduce diversity, you should not only think about the trial participants, but think about investigators, but also the diseases that you invest in, because those are the diseases that affect these minority or disadvantaged populations. And then the locations where you invest. We think locations are big, and that's why most of our work tries to look at investments in low and middle income countries. And then who is doing the investing? Is it the government? Is it donors and all? We think that there should be skin in the game for everyone. And so here, to the point that I started with, where do you spend the money? We think location is very important, because location determines the access you have to participants. The location also determines the investigators that are around. Like Professor Bukhari just mentioned now that there's very little capacity in many African countries. So wherever you decide to invest in, right, that will determine what you have. It also determines who is investing, determines the kinds of diseases, whether you're able to recruit enough people for the trials, what you spend on, and then how you spend. If you want to invest in improving diversity, you should take the long-term view. The modeling we've seen, we've done in our center suggests when we model things over a 10 to 12 year horizon, then you see benefits. If you're looking at the short term, 3 to 5 years, you're probably not going to see much, and then it doesn't make the business case. And then you should build domestic capacity. In manufacturing, they try to start with the fill and finish and then the backward integration. In clinical trials, it's different, right? You need to have the site ready to go. You need to have the expertise. And now everyone is talking about building platforms and different kinds of adaptive trials and all. These require expertise. So it needs patient capital to invest in building this capacity in these countries, in the domestic, in the countries, and then waiting to see how these things, the investments yield fruit. Now, one point I'd like to highlight here is how you invest is important, because coordination versus competition matters. If you invest Right now, using COVID as an example, and the desire for Africa to manufacture its own vaccines, a lot of countries want to build their own manufacturing capacity. But it makes a difference if you're manufacturing for your domestic market versus if you're manufacturing for a regional or continental market, because you need to take care of the demand side and the supply side. So maybe not every country should be manufacturing. Maybe some countries should do clinical trials and network with other countries. But that's a question and a discussion that has to be had between the countries. And that's where you will now have to decide whether it makes more sense to coordinate versus compete. And this last point here says is really about foreign domestic direct investment is great, but it will also be nice for African countries to spend more. Actually, African countries need to spend more in order to get this up and rolling. So finally, the study that I mentioned, we did an investment case just to look at what it would cost to invest in clinical trials in 3 countries. And you'll see the top part of the table talks about the regional markets. That's investing in clinical trial capacity and manufacturing for regional markets, and that's for exports. And then the lower part of the table looks at the ones for just domestic consumption. And the key point here, you look at the ones in red, you'll see that if there is exports, then you can see that the benefit cost ratios are high. But if they are not exports, you see that they are lower. And specifically comparing Kenya to South Africa, you can see that South Africa will still make gains, even if it's a domestic market, because it's larger, the burden of disease is higher, but Kenya will not. And it's important to note that we just modeled for HIV, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases, and pneumonia for vaccines and drugs. So this is illustrative of the case that how you invest, what you invest in matters. And the last slide is we also did a study to look at pooled funding mechanisms for poverty-related diseases. And we also looked at the same countries. And what we see here, option 1 is just looking at vaccines and new therapies that will come. So we looked at everything that was in the pipeline and projected forwards to see what will happen. And you can see that for the benefits cost ratios for vaccines on the right-hand side, the option 1, blue, is so high, but the number of deaths averted is small. But on the other hand, when you adopt investment in a broad range of product archetypes and diseases, your benefits cost ratios are low, the feasibility is low, but the number of people you save are high. So I think those trade-offs are important, and those discussions need to be had for the countries. I'll stop here, and yeah.
No, thank you so much, Prof. I think I have managed the first round. I just want to make sure that I've given everybody an opportunity to sort of highlight the key challenges before we come to solutions. Do I have Prof. Moses? Yes. If maybe we can start looking at the practical ways of increasing diversity in our clinical trials, and also to start thinking about things like what exactly is it that we can do better to improve participation, widen our base, and make sure that our eligibility criteria ensures that we bring as many people as we can in terms of addressing the current gaps that we have in doing meaningful clinical trials.
Right, so Dr. Mabuya, I mean, what you've just stated centers around good practice. But as the previous speaker just said, in order to enable that, we need to ensure that we have the capacity for our scientists, our clinical trialists, to do this. So the problem we have in Africa, as I said before, was that we had very limited countries. So we had South Africa. In South Africa, they were focusing mostly on HIV/AIDS and TB. So there was little diversity in terms of the diseases that they were focusing on. When you go to other countries, smaller countries like Burkina Faso, I mean, they'll have big clinical trials like the recent for malaria vaccine, but that is just around malaria. So we need to ensure that a lot of countries have got the capacity to do this. And in order to do that, we just have to find models of funding these countries. So what we're doing in EDCTP, so we are making sure that, so first of all, our funding targets a lot of other diseases apart from the main ones. I mean, so we do a lot of neglected tropical diseases. And then so outside the HIV, TB, and malaria, we're focusing on diarrhea diseases, neglected tropical diseases. But one thing that is very encouraging in terms of our capacity and what is clear now that we can get other countries who've not been involved before to come on board is what happened during COVID-19. I mean, today we're talking about innovation. Now, it became very clear, for instance, that African countries without a North-South collaboration can really bring about innovative ideas like genotyping of the COVID virus. Nigeria was ahead of a lot of countries, even in Europe, to do that in March. And a lot of other African countries that completely did the genotyping, like South Africa, like Ghana, they did it without having contributions from partners in the North. So I think we have the skills, we've been able to demonstrate the skills. What we need to do now is to try and provide funding and enable the environment and support ethics and regulatory authorities to have an overview for this. So I think those are the things that are important.
Thank you so much. Let me come back to Prof. Veronica and just check if there's any role that technology can play to help us overcome some of the barriers that we've now mentioned to date. Does technology play any role? And if so, what role can it play to help us overcome some of the barriers, some of the practical solutions that we can offer? Over to you, Professor Veronica.
Yeah, thank you so much for directing that question at me. I mean, when we talk about technology, there's just so much that we can think of, right, in terms of biotechnology, but also informational technology and how we use data, for example, I think is extremely, extremely important. So how data is gathered, how it is used, how algorithms are developed, and that, for example, is an area where I think either, often unintentionally, we really bring in then, we build in disparities into the algorithms that are used. So maybe what I could do is just share a little bit about the work we do, so that I can use some of those points for. Let me see if I can share this screen.
Go ahead. You can share, Prof.
Yeah, there. You can see the slide, right?
Yes, we can.
So yeah, so one of the projects we're working on is the prevention of HIV infection, so what we call PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. And the forum concept is really that we form one table where patients and everyone else from the community, industry, regulators, and academia can really come together to enhance clarity, innovation, and collaboration and reduce redundancy, development time, and risk. And I think this model has been applied very successfully for HIV and hepatitis C and other diseases. And I think that that's really one, if we can build this kind of a community at the local level. And Professor Abdul Karim has recently had a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, a commentary where she talks about the future of pre-exposure prophylaxis. And we have all of these new types of drugs that might be once monthly tablets or 6 monthly injections and annual implants that would be so good, we all believe, as opposed to a daily oral pill, just like we have in contraception. But we need to get these drugs approved and how we do that. And without going too much into the statistical and technical details of these trials, is, really thinking about what we really need to know. If we're doing HIV prevention studies, we really need to know about what is the HIV incidence in those communities where these studies are being done. And that's not always so easy to do. And but what we're proposing is that we get away from this kind of the traditional clinical trial design, which depends on superiority or non-inferiority, And again, I don't really have time to get into all of that, but really think about using a counterfactual placebo estimate of the HIV incidence. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but we've been working on that for a while, and it really does seem to make sense. So that the primary efficacy analysis really would be the new PrEP intervention, which could be an annual implant or a monthly pill or an injection every 6 months. But we then need to come together and really figure out what is the HIV incidence in that community. And there's many sources of data that can be used for that. We can have the community incidence. We can have many different sources of data that come into this calculation of what that would be. And this is, I think, really where technology can also help to really bring some of this together and really embed, because this approach really requires that we embed the trial in the community. And so when we then look at doing the counterfactual, if we have a counterfactual placebo estimate that we can compare then as a primary efficacy analysis, the new intervention and the standard of care is there for an additional benchmark, it really makes so much sense. And that's really one way then to really engage everyone in that. So what's really required for that is the community participation at the local, regional, and as well global level. To be fully integrated into the planning and evaluation steps of this approach. It will require quite a bit of education because we're going away from this sort of traditional approach that everyone is more familiar with, which is, my treatment is better than the previous treatment. It also does require a lot of international and global conversation amongst all the regulatory authorities, organizations like the WHO, but of course also regional and national epidemiologic and surveillance program. And also when sponsors come in to make sure that we have responsible use of data and data sharing in terms of if two sponsors are doing trials in the same region, are they coming up with the same counterfactual placebo estimate? And that's very important for the whole community to make sure that that data is really available there. So I think also in terms of technology, we can also talk about technology transfer. And I think that's been discussed a lot in the area of how can we get more diagnostics and vaccine production and manufacturing actually happening in Africa. And I think organizations like the African CDC with John Nkangasong, that is such an important vision that he has for that. But in essence, we can look at technology in so many different ways. And I think we need to use technology responsibly to make sure that we have this transfer of capacity and transfer of knowledge and expertise so that 10 years from now, we're not having still the same conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I'm going to come back to Dr. Jude just to check if maybe there are any specific barriers that maybe we could also, share some practical ways to increase diversity in clinical trials. And I'm thinking in terms of funding of these trials, what can we do to broaden our participants or to encourage more participants to take part in our clinical trials? That's one. Can we decentralize some of these clinical trials? Please share if you've got any ideas around that. And how can we remove some of the financial barriers, especially amongst our trial participants, that we want them to take part in this? Over to you.
Thank you. I think if I may, I have one last slide to share as well to sort of focus us, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Can you see what I am sharing?
Yes, we can see.
Great, thank you. So I think if I may call your attention to the third third major pillar about embedding inclusive principles into clinical trial life cycle. If we could focus on that, that could help us anchor the response that I'll give to your question specifically about what could be done to remove the barriers. I think Professor Miller and I think also Dr. Osundu really captured it as well, but I just want to bring it from the sponsor perspective, like the organization or the entity that designs and leads the conduct and execution, also funds the conduct of these trials. So we're using, I think Dr. Miller called it out, the community-based participatory research, which is a newer approach going forward, where we really have the patients and their communities at the center of what we're doing. And I think starting very early on to get their perspectives before we even design the trial. And as we're getting those perspectives, the insights that we're learning from those, we are setting up measures and mechanisms to remove the barriers that we are identifying during these interactions with the patients, their communities, the patients' caregivers. So literally having that communication and conversation with the patient's ecosystem, every aspect as that patient is, even at home, step foot out of the door of their home to eventual participation in any healthcare facility and so forth. We really want to gather that insight. And it would go into the design, as I mentioned, then we plan and set up mechanisms to remove these barriers, which some of those mechanisms could be, I mentioned the example of transportation from, I was focused on the US for now. Some other examples could be even parking, for example. Some of these institutions might charge parking fees. How do we take care of that? And also provide even other measures to alleviate the burdens. Maybe the patient has a child and maybe needs some support for child care or elderly care as well, just naming a few. But the goal is that keeping this conversation, this line of communication with the patients and the community, and also checking in as we conduct the trials with all those mechanisms that we've put in place to remove the barriers, to see how these mechanisms are working, measure the enrollment targets in real time to ensure that we are developing or we are having the appropriate representation, and also taking sort of mitigation, we put in mitigation steps, but also adapting and sort of being agile in our approach to really ensure we see results. And then as we even go on to even close the trials as well, to also share that data to the patients about their participation. Currently, of course, we do share results in, let's say, reputable medical journals or clinicaltrials.gov from the US perspective, but we recognize that patients do not usually have access to this. So how do we work with the communities as well to bring these results of the trials and the patients' populations back to them? Now, the question, your question about decentralization, which we like to use the term taking the trials as close to the patients where they live and work as possible, that we are currently working on identifying potential partners that could work with us. As we're in the design phase as well, we are asking the questions with the design teams, what aspect of these could be decentralized? Must this be at a central large healthcare facility, or can we decentralize certain aspects that could be done closer to where the patient lives? Are there aspects that could even be done at the patient's home without needing the patient to leave their home? One thing that this COVID-19 pandemic has shown with ongoing clinical trials that I was part of one at the time, the regulators are recognizing that clinical trials are highly regulated from a sponsor, every clinical trial in general. We have to get the buy-in, and the regulators were open for decentralization. So we hope that some of these measures that were piloted during the COVID-19 pandemic would stay, and we could hopefully through this decentralization efforts of taking aspects closer to the patient and removing or reducing the barriers, maybe we could now see some long-term results. I think with that, I can sort of just close by saying that in addition to what I mentioned, the collaboration is really important. I think just to mention a few points that I think it was both Professor Bediako and Dr. Osundu mentioned, the investments that need to be done also at the level of the institutions that are closer to where the patients do live. We can do so much, but a lot of times recognizing that we have a timeline, if some collaborator or institution probably doesn't have the right infrastructure, it might take a while to get them up to speed. So even though we have the plan and approach to meet the patients where they are and the institutions where these patients go where they are, the reality is that some institutions might not be ready or have the infrastructure to run the clinical trials, and we could only do so much to meet those timelines. So, and my closing comment to this question is really sort of re-emphasizing the theme here that investment really needs to occur and needs to occur really soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I will be taking another final round of comments. If I can maybe address this last one to Professor Usando. Is there a role for genomics in diversifying clinical trials? Sorry, did you hear my question? Is there a role for genomics in diversifying clinical trials? Prof. Usando?
Yes, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mabuya. Yes, there's certainly a role for genomics in diversifying clinical trials. When you think about the different gene banks and also the advances in genomics that have occurred in high-income countries, transferring that kind of learning to low and middle-income countries, especially countries in Africa, will have significant impact. The problem, though, is that the infrastructure that is needed, as has been said multiple times today, and the capacity that is needed to take advantage of that, or first of all, to build that capacity and also to take advantage of that in these sub-Saharan African countries are not existent or are functioning at a very, 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 very little range. There's been a lot of advancements that allow the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning approaches with the data that have been collected over time, right, with genomics, to even prevent the need for certain trials. So you can use existing data to achieve or get at the answers that you want and obviate the need for putting people through the stress of these clinical trials, which makes science to move faster than it would have moved if we were going through the traditional approach. So I think that there's certainly a role, but it still comes back to if you want to meet people where they are, if you want to get the historically neglected or marginalized people included in trials, both as investigators and as participants, then there must be significant investments in ensuring that this happens. The technology is there for sure, and technology is already being used in certain contexts. It will just be to make sure that they are more available to these populations.
Okay, thank you so much. I will now be taking more like closing remarks in terms of this particular session. I just want to check with Professor Moses. Are there any issues that we need to address in terms of stigma and discrimination amongst our
Hashem. Wow, the best.
There's a cross
Sorry,
there's a cross line. I think I'm not sure who's got a cross line. Prof, I will repeat my question. Yes, I will repeat my question is that is there a need to address stigma, discrimination, ethical issues around or practical ways of increasing diversity in our clinical trials, specifically focusing on those areas around stigma, discrimination, or any other ethical matters around that? Over to you, Prof. Moses.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So again, I mean, when people talk about clinical trials, as we've seen, it's been a lot around like basic science, high-tech science. So what has not been supported a lot, and funders are now paying attention to that, is community engagement. So I mean, we've had Usundu talk about that, and Veronica. So from the point of view of funders, I think we realize that's very important, and we're also now paying special attention to social science as well, especially what happened during the COVID. So in order to handle all these issues around gender, around poverty, around communities living in really poor environments, we need to support study work packages that are dedicated to engaging the community, and also paying attention and ensuring that social science is really important in this regard. And also, again, instead of just supporting scientists in the lab and clinical trialists, we've realized now from COVID that it is very important to support the training of field epidemiologists who are going out and engaging people who are from the community and know what to handle this. So, Dr. Mabuya, from the point of view of funders, we've now realized that funding should go towards these areas, and we are making an effort to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we are left with only about 5 minutes. So my last question, I'm going to address it to Professor Veronica. Is there a way maybe we can create public policy that talks to this, or maybe even create scorecards that could help us in a practical way to increase diversity in clinical trials?
I really like that question. Thank you so much. I think, again, if we think about communities coming from the ground up saying, and I really liked how you displayed that, Jude, in terms of the, first of all, finding out what the needs of the community are, and then really outlining the principles of that kind of participation. If we really think of it coming up from the ground up in that way, I think it's the communities that should give scorecards, in terms of if there's a pharmaceutical company coming in and doing a new study in a community and that has not observed all of these different things we have talked about, I think that really would be one way to get started. But of course, also, I think we would need to think about that in terms of funders. If we have different national federal funding in the US or Europe or specific countries, that they also really, really pay attention to this. And I think that's where the funders have sometimes not done enough to really make sure that these kinds of principles are adhered to.
Thank you so much. I think we are already out. We are now completely out of time. I do want to take this opportunity to thank the esteemed panelists for your contribution in this topic. And I've got no doubt that the future is bright. Technology has also helped us to do things differently. There's always an ethical side of things. We must always take our ethics with us in moving forward and making sure that we are as inclusive and we broaden our participants as we can. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I would like to thank you for taking part in this session, and thank you so much for all your contributions. Thank you so much. That is all from my side.